Hello and welcome to Diecast Diaries. I'm Dan and welcome back to my review of the Ertl Force 1 range of diecast military aircraft. In this video we're going to be having a look at the remaining planes from the range, as well as the helicopters and the 3 military vehicles. In my first video, most of the aircraft I covered were American, which is perhaps understandable given that Ertl themselves are an American company. But the first one we're going to have a look at tonight is actually a Russian plane in the form of the MiG-29, known by its NATO code name of Fulcrum. So this would have been probably the most current fighter plane in Russian service around the time of the late 80s, early 90s. The model itself dates from 1990. As a feature of the later ones, as I mentioned in the first video, is that they tended to have the black plastic tyres as opposed to the silver ones, which of course look much, much better. There are 3 MiGs that Ertl released, all of which I've got here, and I think they tend to be some of the harder ones to find. All 3 of the MiGs are ones that have ended up picking up off eBay. They're not ones I've had since I was little. Unfortunately, 2 of them are probably the ones I've got that are in the worst condition out of any other models from the range, this being one of them. So although it does have its 4 missiles, and again, sort of nice attention to detail from Ertl, giving it 4 unique missiles. I think these are supposed to be AFID, air-to-air missiles. There are a few chips on it. I think it should have more markings. I'm thinking the ones that it's got are the ones that Ertl would have tampoed at the factory. As I mentioned in the first video, each aircraft came with its own little set of stickers, which were to be applied when you bought it. And it doesn't seem to have many other sort of markings on it at all. So I'm thinking it might be missing those. Also, the undercarriage is quite loose. As I said in the first video, it was a feature of these, unfortunately, that over time the undercarriage could become quite loose. But apart from that, as I say, it's not too bad. It's in a nice sort of green and grey scheme. Still quite a glossy scheme, which was a feature of kind of the earlier models from the range. But yes, that's the first release of the MiG-29. Put that over there. Well, the second release, this dates from 1993. It's one I was never particularly bothered about when I was little. As I said in my first video, air show schemes and things like that weren't ones that ever really kind of did it for me. I much prefer the normal military schemes. Now, I'm assuming this is a genuine scheme. I've yet to see a photograph of a MiG-29 that kind of matches this. The Russians, I don't think, ever tended to have a proper aerobatic display team like the Red Arrows or the Thunderbirds or anything. What they did tend to have is either a single or maybe a pair of aircraft that went round performing at air shows that were given their own special scheme. There was quite a well-known incident in 1993 where a pair of MiG-29s were performing at an air show in the UK, and both collided during their display routine. Thankfully, both the pilots ejected safely. Now, those 2 aircraft were in quite a smart yellow and blue scheme. So I'm guessing this is meant to represent something similar to that. Similar to the first MiG-29, this is another one that's not in great condition. There are a few sort of chips on the paintwork, and unfortunately, this one is missing all 4 of its missiles. It's obviously quite a common feature if you pick these up second-hand, unboxed. The missiles, as they just clip onto the wings underneath, it's quite easy for them to kind of go missing. So yeah, but as I said, all of the MiG-29s I think aren't particularly easy to find, and this one, to be fair, it'll just do as a gap filler until I'm able to kind of pick one up that's hopefully in better condition. So I think the wheels they stay up a bit better than they did on the first one. So you can kind of see that's what the wheels look like when they're folded up. So they kind of partially, they sort of partially go into like these sort of wells inside the wings, but easy enough to kind of grab, to bring down so you can land it again. That's the second MiG-29. And then the last one, well, this one I've not been able to find a release date for, but again, similar to some of the others, I'm guessing it must be around the sort of 1993, 1994 sort of time frame, given the fact it's in the sort of a matte paint scheme, which a lot of the later ones were. This is another one that, like a couple of the Harriers from the first video, I wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware it existed until I came across this particular one on eBay. Luckily, I was able to get it. It was unboxed, but in mint condition with the 4 missiles again. So this one's actually in East German markings, which is quite an unusual one. And I'd originally thought when I was kind of getting these models together that it was kind of in exactly the same colour scheme as the Russian one, but just with different stickers. But as you can see, it is actually a completely different camouflage scheme, which is nice. So it is actually a completely unique scheme for this aircraft. I think this is actually the hardest of the three MiG-29s to get, so yeah, doubly pleased that I was able to pick this one up. I think I got it about 10 years ago off eBay, something like that. But yeah, it's not one that crops up a lot. So that's the East German MiG-29. Probably my favourite of the three of the MiGs, to be fair. And then we move on to the next aircraft. So it's another American aircraft, but this one, when it came out, really kind of took me by surprise. So it's an F-4 Phantom, probably one of the most famous aircraft in history, an aircraft that kind of doesn't really need much of an introduction. Introduced in like the early 60s, saw very wide service during the Vietnam War. It had been in service with not only the US Air Force, US Navy, US Marines, but also quite a number of other air forces as well, Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, to name just a couple of other organisations that have used it. Now, although the Phantom would still have been in US Air Force service when this model came out, this particular one was released in 1989, it certainly wouldn't have been in frontline fighter roles like it used to have been, like it would have been previously. So when this one came out, especially as this one seems to be in a bit of a Vietnam type colour scheme, I kind of got my hopes up that Ertl were going to start releasing some more older type aircraft, maybe some more sort of other Vietnam War ones, things like that. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. This was the oldest aircraft that Ertl did as part of the range, but it's definitely one of my favourites. So as I say, I do think this one's in kind of like a Vietnam type colour scheme. I'm guessing it obviously does represent a specific aircraft. You've got the shark's mouth, you've got a couple of crew names under the cockpit there, and squadron markings on the tail fin. And again, its own unique weapons load. You've got a mix of Sparrow and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles and a couple of fuel tanks. And this one, when you put the wheels up, they do kind of recess quite nicely into the wings. So I'll just fold those down again. Yeah, the Phantom, definitely one of my favourites from the range. Just a pity that, as I say, Ertl didn't sort of do any other older aircraft. So that's the first release of the Phantom. And then in 1993, they released this version, which arguably is even nicer. I think so this one's in like a two-tone grey matte scheme. Though Ertl referred to this one as a wild weasel. Wild weasel is a term the US Air Force applied to any aircraft whose job is to seek out and destroy enemy air defences. So things from like radar sites, surface-to-air missile sites, things like that. Quite a dangerous job. The Phantom came into service in that role, I think, towards the end of the Vietnam War, and it stayed in that role throughout the 80s and into the early 90s. It was actually the last version of the Phantom in US Air Force service in like any kind of a frontline combat role, finally retired in the mid-90s, replaced by the F-16. This one, with the SP on the tail fin, represents an aircraft from Spangdahlem Air Base, which is in Germany. It's still a current US Air Force base, and the role of the Wild Weasel has since been taken over by F-16s, which is what's based at Spangdahlem to this day. So really nice squadron markings on the side of the air intakes. We got the subdued version of the star and bar on the side, which is obviously what they started using sort of from like the late 80s and up to sort of the current day, present day. But yeah, really nice version of the Phantom, this one. So the Wild Weasel version of the Phantom is known as the F4G. So it's quite a specialist version. It has the same missiles as the early release, of course. The actual Wild Weasel would have, as well as carrying some missiles for safe defence, it would have a couple of specific missiles for attacking enemy radar sites, known as a harm missile. But yeah, you can kind of forgive Ertl for just giving this one the same missiles as the previous one. But yeah, I think that is one of the nicest ones. It would have been probably one of the last models that Ertl released as part of the range, but I definitely think that's one of the nicest ones. So that's Phantom. It is kind of a bit of a shame that, given how many air forces, navies use the Phantom, that those were the only two that Ertl did. They could really have done quite a wide range of different ones, but whether it's because it was towards the end of the range, as I say, I do think the last models were kind of released around about 1994, something like that. I don't know, but yeah, it's a shame. But I think certainly those two are two of my definite favourites from the range. And another favourite, and another British aircraft, is this one. It's the Panavia Tornado GR1. This one in a really nice RAF Desert Storm scheme. So again, it represents a specific aircraft. In this case, it's one named Armoured Charmer. You can see it's got its mission tally markings under the cockpit there. So Tornadoes, widely used in Desert Storm. They were often tasked with some really dangerous low-level missions. 6 aircraft actually being lost during the course of the war. So as I say, there were certainly very, very sort of dangerous missions that they faced, attacking things like Iraqi airfields. This one, as I say, like all the other aircraft's got its own unique weapons load. So it's got the sort of sets of, I think, just normal iron bombs underneath. I'm not sure what the large missiles are under the wings, and the other things look like sort of maybe chaff dispensers or sensor pods, I think, something like that. Well, this is a really nice one because the undercarriage, first of all, it's in a really nice sort of matte scheme. The desert scheme's been done really well on this. The undercarriage retracts really nicely, and it kind of recesses quite nicely into the fuselage there. But the other great feature, just like the real one, and like the Tomcat that I showed in the first video, the wings swing. Now, unlike the Tomcat, this one actually has weapons mounted under the wings, but luckily Ertl's mounted them on just sort of cylindrical mounts, so you can just quickly rotate them like that. They look nice and straight. I'll just straighten that one up as well. So yeah, so you've got your Tomcat, your Tornado with the wings out, and it looks really good. So yeah, unfortunately, this is another one, a bit like the Phantom, where they could have done other schemes, but this is the only version of the Tornado that they did. Real shame. They could have done a nice sort of one, another RAF one in kind of the normal green and grey style camouflage. They could have also done a German or an Italian one. But yeah, again, maybe again, because it was getting towards the end of the range, I'm not really sure. But yeah, really nice one, that. It's funny that the nose art on RAF planes during the Gulf War in 1991 was really quite a feature of them. And it's kind of a bit of a vice versa situation from World War II, where virtually all American aircraft had nose art on them. Some of it quite risque, especially for the 1940s. But come Desert Storm, it was the RAF planes that had the nose art, and the US Air Force that didn't tend to. It was kind of rarer for them to, and I think any nose art they did have was sort of fairly tame by comparison. So it's kind of sort of quite strange that it's kind of like the sort of roles reversed from sort of World War II. But yeah, it looks nice with that scheme. As I say, it does represent an actual aircraft. So that's the Panavia Tornado GR1. We'll pop that there. And then the last two kind of normal planes, or normal size planes from the range, I think were both examples of Ertl trying to get ahead of the game. So the first one, it's quite a recognisable aircraft now. Clearly it's now the Eurofighter Typhoon, but when this model was released, which was in 1990, this was just known as the European Fighter Aircraft. You can see it's actually got EFA on the tail fin. So this was a joint project between the British, the Germans, the Spanish and the Italians to jointly develop a fighter plane that would then obviously enter service with all 4 of their air forces. And you can see, because by this point the aircraft hadn't entered service, this is obviously in the markings of like a sort of a demonstrator or prototype. So it's got a unique roundel that incorporates the colours of all 4 air forces. As I mentioned, it's got the sort of EFA type logo. It says Eurofighter on the tail fin. Now this is an aircraft, I think, that although it's in kind of quite widespread use now, it actually seemed to have quite a protracted development. So I think the original aircraft, known as I think also as the EAP, I think, dated from the mid-80s. But actually it wouldn't be until sort of the mid-90s by the time the actual Eurofighter Typhoon kind of first flew. So it did seem to be in development for quite a long time. Whether it's because 4 different countries were involved, I'm assuming cost would have been a part of it as well. The actual aircraft would eventually enter service in 2003. So yeah, it took a long while to get there, but it's certainly provided sterling service now. It's obviously the RAF's main fighter plane now, along with the F-35. Unfortunately with this one, the missile seemed to be particularly vulnerable. It does have quite an impressive loadout, it has to be said. But I noticed as I was putting this together, first of all, you can see this missile on the side here has got a crack in it. There's one of these that's got a crack, and then there was another 2 that unfortunately have just completely broken in half. And I've tried to sort of attach them together, but I've just not had much luck, unfortunately. So for now, I think I'll just have to leave this one with 2 missiles missing, making it look like it's obviously been in a bit of action. Which is a shame, because other than that, it's in a really nice scheme. Now, of course, as this was an aircraft that hadn't entered service, there is only this one version of it, so obviously there wasn't really any others that Ertl could have done as part of it. But it's nicely done, nice sort of 2-tone grey scheme. And I think with the sort of colourful multinational markings, it really make it stand out. So that's the Eurofighter, I think it was just known as by Ertl, but obviously nowadays known as the Typhoon. And then the last normal-sized aircraft as part of the range, it's another one where it certainly wouldn't have been an aircraft in frontline service. So nowadays, this is the F-22 Raptor, also the most advanced fighter plane in US Air Force service. But this model represents the YF-22, which was the prototype. So this is an aircraft, the model itself, dates from 1993. So again, it's one of the last models from the range. The aircraft itself, I think, first flew in, the early 90s, but it wouldn't enter squadron service until about 2005. So again, it's another aircraft that had a very long, sort of quite protracted development. This one, of course, doesn't have any missiles underneath the wings, as similar to the F-117 from the first video, it has an internal weapons base where it only opens when it's actually firing a missile, because it does have a lot of stealth capability. That's probably a reason why it was in development for so long. It's a very advanced aircraft. At least with this one, because it's the YF-22, the markings on the tail are probably a little bit more eye-catching than they would normally be. But yeah, it's a nice one, this. Another one I picked up, I actually got it from the same seller I got the East German MiG-29 from. The good thing with this one, because it doesn't have any missiles, it's one that you can pick up unboxed quite easily. But yes, that's the YF-22, to be kind of more exact. I don't think at this point it had been given a name. I think Ertl just called it the YF-22. So I'll put that there. Now, there are two other planes as part of the range, but they're kind of a completely different size to the rest of them. So the first one I've got is this one, which is the SR-71 Blackbird. So you can see straight away it's about twice the size of the rest of them. Still all metal, like the other ones, and still with the same retractable undercarriage that the other models all have. This is another one where they've done away with the cockpit glass. It wouldn't really work sort of doing this, because it doesn't have like a proper canopy. Just got little bits of glass, so it's painted it black, which you can kind of is understandable with this one. So the SR-71, very well-known aircraft, long been, although it's not in service anymore, not been in service since the late 90s. It's the aircraft that still holds the speed record, and I think also altitude record for a jet-powered aircraft, flying at a speed of 3 times the speed of sound. Quite a dramatic-looking aircraft, really sort of, quite sinister-looking to a degree as well. But it's an aircraft that doesn't have any weapons, because its only mission was reconnaissance. So the SR in its name standing for Strategic Reconnaissance. It's an aircraft that entered service back in the sort of mid-60s. So it's seen a lot of service, but I think it was always an aircraft that was kind of quite expensive to operate. And I suppose a lot of what it did can now be done by satellites and things like that. So yeah, it was withdrawn from service in the late 90s. Sadly, it's one aircraft that I would love to have seen actually fly. There was a detachment of these based at RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk during the 1980s. And I used to go on holiday to Suffolk every year, so we'd see aircraft from all the other bases, but sadly, I never saw a Blackbird, which would have been really, really quite spectacular to see. But yeah, so there were 2 large aircraft that Ertl released. So this was the first one, and each of them came with its own unique plastic stand. So you can see there, SR-71 Blackbird, and it just attaches underneath. The only thing I found is they didn't stay on the stands too well, and it does sort of wobble a little bit. It's not actually kind of staying on its stand sort of particularly well. It does sort of immediately kind of lean backwards. So just in case it decides to fall off, I'm going to just take it off its stand, and I'll pull the undercarriage down again. Now, the Blackbird was released in 1988. There we go. So I'll just pop that one there. And in the same year, they released the other one of the larger aircraft, which is the B-1 bomber. This is another aircraft that had an extremely protracted development. The original version, the B-1, which is what Ertl have decided to do a model of, ended up being cancelled. It's an aircraft that I think had very high costs. It was also its the purpose of its mission kind of changed a number of times, whether it was going to be nuclear armed and things like that. So it ended up being resurrected, and an improved version was known as the B-1B. Eventually became known as the Lancer. That's still in service to this day. It's actually the bomber in the US Air Force that has the largest payload capacity, even bigger than the B-52. So it's an impressive aircraft. But this one, being in the white overall scheme, represents the earlier B1 version. So this is technically not an aircraft that would have entered service, but it's a really nice one from Ertl. Another one of my favourites from the range. Again, with the cockpit, they've decided just to paint over it, painted it black. Biggest shame with this one is that they've decided, it was a shame given that Ertl's attention to detail on the range was tended to be pretty good, in that they've given it a star and bar on both wings. US Air Force aircraft would only ever have it on the upper left or lower right wing. Apart from that, it's a nice model, and again, similar to the Tornado and the Tomcat, it has working swing wings. Now, I think something has gone slightly wrong with the mechanism on mine, as they don't always move together, although they seem to be behaving there. So, yeah, the wings do swing back like that. Obviously, again, undercarriage retracts, but like that. And this is another one that came with its own unique stand. Unfortunately, this one being white, plastic, it has discoloured a bit over time. This is another aircraft, F-22, that doesn't tend to stay on its stand particularly well. So I'll just see if I can get it to balance just for the sake of the video. So yeah, it's on the stand there, but it didn't seem to take it long before it tends to go for a bit of a nosedive. So again, just to save it falling off during the video, I shall take it off its stand and put the undercarriage down again. So because this is an aircraft that has an internal bomb bay, you can see the bomb bays there. It's another one that doesn't need to have any missiles or anything like that. There we go, got the wheels down. So these two aircraft, as I say, both released in 1988. And yeah, they didn't do, unfortunately, didn't do any kind of other larger scale ones. But yeah, these two are two sort of particularly nice ones from the range, I think. Just put the B1, put it over there, I think, to get it out of the way. So then we move on to the helicopters. Now, the helicopters were all introduced in 1989. The first one we've got here is the AH-64 Apache. So this would have been an aircraft, very much the sort of a new helicopter came into service in the 80s. Originally flew in 1975, but came into service in I think 1986. This is the earlier version of the Apache. Obviously, the modern ones that are still in service now have got the big sort of radar mounted on top of the rotor mast. This is like an earlier version. I think the Apache is probably my least favourite of the helicopters. I just think the Ertl model's a little bit too chunky. I just don't think the shape translates particularly well. This is the only one of the helicopters that actually has the earlier silver style wheels. It's also the only one of the helicopters that has any kind of a variant. There is a slightly earlier version where the text on the tail boom and the star, and I think also must be the serial number as well, are done in white as opposed to black. Obviously, this is a later one when they decided to sort of start camouflaging things like that a bit more. So it's got the chain gun under the nose, which is in plastic. This is one that unfortunately has suffered a bit like quite a lot. Some of the other ones I've got where the missiles have started to crack. You can see this is another one I've had since I was little, and you can see I've obviously applied a little bit of blue tack to make them like the rocket pods and the missiles sort of stay on. But you can see the sort of twin missile things have both sort of split at the end, but luckily they just about kind of stay on. The stickers that came with the Apache, I think, were disappointing. You can see the ones for the tail to mark like where the sort of tail rotor is. Two of them have gone missing, and the other two, they never really stuck on that well. They just immediately wanted to kind of peel off again. The stripes around the engines, similar. They've kind of generally stayed on, but I think that was another reason why the Apache is probably not my favourite model from the range. The rotors, by the way, do fold in, so obviously that's how it came in its packet. They were sold in the sort of blister style packaging rather than the big sort of cardboard boxes, but the same sort of style packaging as the aircraft. So that's the AH-64 Apache. The second helicopter is another Russian aircraft, so it's the Mi-24 known as the Hind, a very well-known aircraft, and I think it's an aircraft that kind of sent sort of a few shockwaves through the West when it first appeared. It's an extremely capable helicopter, so it's an attack helicopter, but it also has the ability to carry, I think, about 8 troops. Got like a cargo compartment here. Very fast helicopter, as unlike the Apache, it actually has retractable undercarriage, and again, the undercarriage quite nicely folds away into the fuselage. Now, this is one that, again, it has stickers for the tail rotor and obviously for the rest of the aircraft as well. Well, these ones kind of went on really nicely, and I actually think these ones look really good, so I much prefer this model to the Apache. The real aircraft does have like a chain gun sticking out the front. Ertl, I think, have decided to omit that from the model, whether it was decided it was going to be a bit too vulnerable or what, I'm not really sure. But again, it's got its unique weapons. So you've got the Russian-style rocket pods and a couple of, I'm guessing, anti-tank missiles. Again, this one's another one that suffered slightly. It's obviously split there. It's a bit of a shame, but as I say, it is a feature of all of them that do tend to, they are sort of quite brittle. So that's the Hind. I'll just pull the undercarriage down, and again, the rotors fold in, so it could be stored. It could like fit in the packaging better. We'll just pop that there, and then we have another absolute favourite of mine from the range. So it's the UH-1 Iroquois, far better known as the Huey. Very well-known helicopter, especially from the Vietnam War, but widely used. I think some are still in service with some countries to this day. This particular version is not in service with the Americans anymore. It's been superseded. Descendants of the Huey are still in service with the US, I think the US Marine Corps. But this earlier version, this would represent either a UH-1D or a H with the sort of slightly longer fuselage. Actually, the first helicopter to be used as a gunship. It was converted as such in Vietnam and fitted with all kinds of armaments. This one's got twin machine guns on each side. They do detach from this, so you can just have it as like a normal transport helicopter. But I think Ertl have captured the look of the Huey really well. Got the correct sort of 2-bladed rotor. Nicely done in olive drab with the kind of anti-glare panel on the nose. Simple markings, nothing too kind of over the top. Just got United States Army on the tail boom and the sort of danger sign pointed to the tail rotor. But yeah, I think that's a really nice one. Definitely my favourite of the 4 helicopters at least. So that's the UH-1 Iroquois. And then the last helicopter they did is actually another Russian one. And this is the Kamov Ka-50, known by its NATO code name of Hokum. Quite unflattering. I think a lot of the NATO code names seem to be quite unflattering, to be perfectly honest. So it's quite a smart-looking helicopter, certainly quite a more sort of streamlined-looking one than the Hind. It's another one that has retractable undercarriage, well, like that. And unlike the Hind, though, it actually has sort of double rotors. Now, those would rotate in opposite directions, which means it doesn't need a tail rotor. So Kamov, I think it's quite a feature of their helicopters. I think either all of them, or certainly a lot of helicopters that they've made over the years, have all had this feature of the kind of double rotors. As I say, it means there's no need for a tail rotor at all. So this is a helicopter that dates from sort of as I say, the model came was released in 1989. The helicopter itself into service in the, I think, early 90s. It's actually the first helicopter that had an ejection system. Obviously, it's quite a difficult thing to achieve in a helicopter, but this one has an ejection system for both the crew, where obviously it jettisons the rotors first before the pilots then sort of come out of the cockpit like they would in a normal sort of fighter plane. So certainly a very advanced helicopter. And updated versions of this are still in service to this day. It's a helicopter that's currently seeing action in the current, obviously, conflict in Ukraine. But yeah, it's a nice one. So a bit of an unusual one, I think, for Ertl to have done. So that's the Kamov Ka-50. And then the last models that I've got are the 3 military vehicles that were released as part of the range. These all came out in 1988. They were, I think, tended to be quite a bit more simple than the aircraft. So this is the first one. It's the M1 Abrams. So this represents the earlier model of the Abrams, which would have been fitted with a 105mm gun. Came into service in the sort of early 80s. started to be phased out by the end of the 80s by the improved version, which has a 120mm gun, but this is definitely the earlier type. You can see, unlike the aircraft which tended to be in specific markings, this one's in very generic US Army markings, still using the white star, which obviously would be very soon to be phased out, as it's obviously got obvious issues from a camouflage point of view. Although the tank is, like the aircraft, all metal, the gun barrel, unfortunately, is plastic. It's kind of a shame that Ertl couldn't have done it in metal as well. Appreciate it is quite thin. At least it is in green, though. It's not been done in sort of black plastic like some others from other ranges have been done. And it's got a plastic 50 caliber on the top. The wheels, I do think the military vehicles and the Abrams in particular, they look a lot simpler than the aircraft. These wheels here are all cast in metal and don't rotate. The ones here are plastic, similar to the sort of sprocket wheel and drive wheel. They're all plastic, and the tracks obviously are rubber. But yeah, it does kind of make the tank look a sort of little bit sort of simple. As I say, normally those wheels would all be the same size. But generally, they've captured the look of the Abrams pretty well. Now, I do actually have a mint boxed one of these, and you can see that they just came in the exact same packaging as the aircraft. The tank in there is exactly the same as the unboxed one I've got. Then on the back just has a bit of information about the real vehicle. So yes, those were in exactly the same packaging as the aircraft. The second vehicle I've got, it's an M113 armoured personnel carrier. Again, in very generic US Army markings and the same green and brown camouflage. Same layout with the tracks, where they've got the three wheels in the middle are just cast metal and don't move, and the ones at the front and back are plastic. This one does have a nice feature where the ramp at the back folds down, although unfortunately the mast for the sort of post where the rivet goes would obviously stop your soldiers coming in and out, or hinder them at least. Now, this particular version is one armed with a TOW anti-tank missile launcher. Now, when I was doing a bit of research before I was doing the video, found out that this particular variant of the M113 is actually technically known as an M150, the version that has this big missile launcher on the top. The M113 itself, I believe it's the most produced tracked vehicle in history. It's a vehicle that dates all the way back to 1960. It's one of the world's first sort of big full-track armoured personnel carriers. It's basically just an armoured box on tracks. Very widely used in the Vietnam War, used by dozens and dozens of different armies over the years. Still in service in a lot of countries, and the Americans themselves will have some in service in some roles, though it's long since passed from its frontline armoured personnel carrier role. But yeah, I think this is my favourite of the three vehicles. I like the sort of, they've captured, I think the shape looks better, they've captured the look of it better than I think they have with the Abrams. And I like the fact it's got the opening door at the back, and the fact as well, it's most of them, the basic armament was the 50 caliber machine gun, but I like the fact they've decided to give this one a bit more of a weapon with the sort of TOW missile launcher. So that's the M113. And then the last military vehicle was the M109 self-propelled gun. Now, because this one's got a larger caliber gun, I was hoping it might have been in metal, but unfortunately, again, it is in plastic. But again, luckily, it's in green plastic, so it blends in quite nicely. Again, of course, obviously, same layout with the tracks and the wheels. And again, it's just in very generic US Army markings. This one just seems to just be in like a plain green scheme. It's not got the green and brown camouflage like the other two. But it's got a nicely detailed, different machine gun on top of the turret. The turret does rotate, and like a howitzer, the gun does, or the barrel rather, does elevate to a decent height. So that's the M109 self-propelled howitzer. So that's the end of the sort of Force One models that I've got. There were other things that appeared as part of the range. They did 3 sets of smaller size aircraft, and by smaller size I mean literally sort of like this sort of size. 3 sets of 2. They're all done in die-cast metal as well. They're just not ones I was ever particularly bothered about. I think I was only ever really interested in the larger aircraft. There were some play sets as well that were released, but I tend to think they may only have been released as in the US. I don't ever remember seeing them in the UK, and because I was such a fan of the Force One range, anything that they released would likely, have been sort of gone straight to the top of either a birthday or a Christmas list. One of the sets was a big air base. You got an F-18 Hornet with it, and then you've got like a mat with a runway on it, control tower, other buildings, and a whole host of vehicles and other accessories. Looks really good. I'd absolutely love to pick one up at some point, but I've never seen one for sale over here. They very rarely come up on eBay in any country, I think. I do have a look from time to time. There were a couple of other play sets they did where you could attach one of the aircraft to a joystick, which had like an infrared system on it. It emitted sound effects, and it came with it was like a radar sight that you could target and knock things out, and it looked quite good. Again, I've never seen those for sale over here. I'm pretty sure they must have been only available in the States. And then there were other little accessories that Ertl did. There was an unusual range of die-cast rifles that were in like a 1:6 scale. And there were 6 different ones, things like the M16, AK-47, MP5, Uzi, M60. Then I think the other one was French rifle, I think French assault rifle. Always found those quite unusual. I didn't really know what you were supposed to do with those. So those do crop up on eBay, but they're not things I've ever been particularly bothered about picking up. And then there were just a few other little accessories that they did, things like patches that you could put on your jacket. I think there was like a baseball cap and stuff like that. Again, a lot of this stuff might only have been available in the States. Certainly, even if it was available over here, I don't think it's stuff I would have ever been particularly bothered about. It was always the aircraft and the military vehicles that I liked. 2 of the vehicles, the Abrams tank and the M113, have seen in a desert scheme. Well, that was released under the name of, I think, Mighty Movers or Military Movers. There were a few also construction vehicles that Ertl did that they also released in military colours. I think they were under the same branding. They were in completely different style packaging. I don't think they mentioned Force One at all. I would still like to pick them up. I suppose you do technically class them as part of the range. But yeah, the main thing I'm sort of trying to concentrate on is getting the other aircraft that I want. As I mentioned in my first video, the 2 that are kind of at the top of my wants list are the Blue Angels Hornet and the grey A10. But the models themselves, they do crop up on eBay sort of quite often. But as I said, the problem with getting unboxed ones is that they're invariably going to be missing any of the accessories. Box ones seem to be going up in price a little bit. You can sort of pick them up for sort of between sort of £15 and £20 for some of them, but others are more than that, certainly more than I've been prepared to pay. And then there are other ones, as I say, that I've just not been able to find at all. But the search continues, but I'm pretty happy with the collection I've got, and it's a nice mix of ones that I've had since my childhood and ones that I've picked up kind of more recently off eBay. So as I say, I'll see how I get on sort of collecting with the other ones, and hopefully I might be able to replace a couple of the ones I've got that aren't in great condition. But for now, I will leave it there. I will be doing some other aircraft-related videos. As much as I kind of compared Skybusters quite unfavourably to the Force One range in my first video, as I did mention in my first video, I am a big fan of the Skybusters range. I do have quite a few of those, so that's one I'll probably do a couple of videos on at some point. But yeah, Ertl Force One range has always been one of my all-time favourite ranges when I was little. So yeah, just thought it'd be quite nice to go through that range with and show it as part of my channel. So I'll leave it there, and in the meantime, please do like, share, subscribe and comment, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.